The basis for today's fellowship is from the epistle to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. So why don't we go ahead and just read that all together. They are the first pair of verses at the top of your sheet. For I am jealous over you with the jealousy of God, for I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. But I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your thoughts would be corrupted from the simplicity and the purity toward Christ. So we see in the first verse, there is this matter of the betrothal. And then in the second verse, there is something that comes in, potentially, to distract or to put in jeopardy that betrothal. So we'll cover both of these aspects. And at the end of it, we want to ask ourselves, well, how do we discern what is, this kind of craftiness that is in verse 3, and how do we avoid it, right? How do we keep ourselves in the divine romance? So keep that in mind as we get towards the end. When we covered the divine romance in Genesis, in the Song of Songs, we considered this matter as something that was somewhat of a given, right? That here's the picture, this is God's heart desire since eternity past, that he wants to have a relationship with us. And then we see this allegorically depicted in the Song of Songs. We also saw in the New Testament some examples of lovers of Christ. I think most poignantly there was, Mary who poured out her alabaster flask, right? Her love offering to the Lord. Well, today I want us to consider the divine romance as something that's in formation, that is always a process, that is something that is in flux. It's something that is cultivated. So in other words, it's not something that's automatic. It's something that we are brought into, something that is formed and that is shaped. And the reason I mention this is because if it's something that is shaped, then it's very possible for it to become unshaped and unraveled, right? So just as we've been brought into the divine romance, I hate to say it, but there's also the possibility that we can kind of be brought out of the divine romance, right? So we want to pay attention to this matter, even of how were we brought into such a realization that we're in this divine romance with the Lord. I don't think without this semester's fellowship on the divine romance that I would have even considered to pray, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. That was from Song of Songs, right? Even in this context, our believing in the Lord, our salvation, our baptism, all of this takes on a deeper meaning. That we're not just saved for the sake of being saved, or baptized just to be baptized, but it's to be brought further along in this divine romance. So that's been the framework this whole semester. And that's what we want to keep in mind, because we don't want to be brought out of it. One of the greatest ministers in the New Testament is, of course, the Apostle Paul. And his ministry had a particular flavor. It had a particular taste, and it had a particular result. The result was that it brought people into this divine romance. So just a little background for the verses that we just read. Corinth is a city, it still exists today. It's about 50 miles southeast of Athens in Greece. And Paul had begun ministering to the churches in Europe. Well, actually, as a result of his ministry tours, he raised up the churches in places like Athens and Thessalonica and Corinth. So it's a result of his ministry that there were a group of believers raised up in the city of Corinth. Shortly thereafter, there were problems. So if you read 1 Corinthians, there are all kinds of nasty things like lawsuits, marriage problems, heresy, evil brothers. And so Paul had to write 1 Corinthians to address those issues. Well, lucky for us, we have some stellar verses like 1 Corinthians 15:45, the last Adam, meaning Christ, became the life-giving spirit. Right? Paul had to write that Christ resurrected to become the life-giving spirit, because there were some who were saying the opposite. Right? Well, in 2 Corinthians, the contextual problem is that there were people known as Judaizers who came in and caused trouble. So you don't want to be with these guys, because what these guys teach is that as Christians, you still need to adhere to the Old Testament laws. So the laws in the Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses, and if you add them all up, it's 613 laws. Once you bring in all the ordinances and the prohibitions, they're known as the 613 mitzvah laws. And so if you're a Judaizer, your life is pretty tough because you have 613 laws to keep, right? I mean, we know there's 10 commandments and then a bunch of ordinances, right? And as we saw a few months ago, these actually are a portrait of who our God is, right? If you want to know who this God is that we're in a relationship with, what's his portrait? What are his characteristics? What's his personality, right? That's what we get from the law. And we were never meant to fulfill it in the first place. That's what Christ is for. And so we just identify ourselves with Christ, right? But to have to keep all these laws by ourselves, that's pretty tough. And this is the situation that Paul was combating in the church in Corinth, is that the very believers he raised up to love the Lord in simplicity and purity, right, were now being led astray by the Judaizers to keep laws and rituals. Now think about it. Your Christian life is very different if you have that kind of a view. Suddenly, being a Christian is all about keeping laws, is about being ritualistic, it's about being obedient, it's about worshiping, versus loving the Lord, being attracted to the Lord, belonging to the Lord, appreciating the Lord. I don't know, when you weigh it that way, which kind of Christian life do you want?